Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about long-range and/or heavy bombers, some of the most powerful aircraft in any military's arsenal, at least in terms of raw power and on-paper destructive potential. What exactly makes a bomber a heavy or long-range bomber generally depends on the country that's using it, and how it compares to their other bombers. For example, Japanese heavy bombers in World War II generally had payloads that were similar to other countries' medium bombers, but compared to other Japanese medium bombers, they had greater payloads, and thus could be called heavy. Now, this is also all semantics, to be honest, and it's kind of mind-numbing to talk about. So instead, let's shift over and talk about why a given military may or may not want to develop heavy bombers. The very clear benefit of them is the sheer power that they possess, the potential to level entire villages, small cities, industrial quarters. Just so much can be destroyed with a single heavy bomber. To help illustrate this point, we'll use America's Mark 84 2,000-pound bomb. A bomb like the Mark 84 can create a crater up to 15 meters wide, and can be lethal via fragmentation up to 120 meters away. Using some math, this means it creates a crater 176 square meters and has a potential lethal area of 45,239 square meters, the equivalent of about 8.5 football fields. Then if you take a bomber like the Vickers Wellington, Britain's most produced bomber in World War II and a medium bomber, it had a capacity around 4,500 pounds, so it could carry two Mark 84s, and at absolute best, with those two bombs, it had a lethal area of about 17 football fields. Then if we take something like the Avro Lancaster, a heavy bomber, with a capacity around 14,000 pounds, its 7 Mark 84s had a lethal area of about 59.5 football fields. Or, if my math is correct, about 2/3 of Vatican City, for a single heavy bomber. So while it would offer unmatched destructive potential, there are also a lot of downsides to building a heavy bomber, in them being a massive investment, incredibly large, and also incredibly vulnerable. Not only are the bombers a massive investment in how many resources it takes to make them, but also in how many of your very valuable explosives that you're packing onto one singular plane. If something were to happen to that plane, the overall loss of resources would be significantly greater than if you lost a single medium bomber. The planes would also be significantly larger dimensionally, which would be much harder to produce and would require new factories to make them. And they would be significantly heavier, which meant that you would need more engines or much more high-powered engines, and if the bomber were to be lost again, that's a lot of those valuable engines being lost that could be used for other planes. Then, for their vulnerability, their massive frame would make them a much bigger target, and that massive frame would also make them completely lack the agility to avoid enemy fire. Basically, while they are incredibly powerful, they're also difficult to make and difficult to keep alive. So, with all of that being said, let's then turn our attention to pre-World War II and wartime Germany, as they were/are known for not fielding heavy bombers during the war, which isn't actually true, but does have a small kernel of truth. For a good part of the war, Germany didn't field a heavy bomber, and were doctrinally against using them. Our subject for today is an earlier attempt by Germany to field a heavy bomber, an attempt that had a clear domino effect on the rest of Germany's time in the war. This is the Junkers Ju-89. The story of the Ju-89 begins back in the very early stages of the Luftwaffe, before its public acknowledgement by the government in 1935, and during its more secretive rearmament period, back when Germany thought that they had to hide the fact that they weren't following the Treaty of Versailles anymore. The then Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe, Walther Wever, was a major supporter of the tactic of strategic bombing, or the tactic of targeting enemy cities, factories, critical infrastructure, civilians, etc., in an effort to reduce enemy ability to wage war from a logistical, materiel, and morale sense. This concept had technically existed since the first days of military aviation, but with then more modern technology and engines and tactics, the strategy had evolved from something that was devastating in theory to something that was actually a threat, and that would be a significant focus of any major military. As a result, in the interwar period, all of the major powers, in countries like America, Britain, France, Italy, and the Soviet Union, developed and produced heavy bombers, with varying payloads, production numbers, and levels of success. An initial exception to this rule was Germany, who from the end of World War I to around 1932 didn't really have a heavy bomber project. This 14-year streak would end after the Weimar government began working on the Dornier Do in secret, in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. Still, Germany's investment in heavy bombers and their air force in general was severely lacking behind in the interwar period, in very large part because of the treaty. And when the Nazis came to power, a major focus of theirs would be defying the treaty, and rapidly and massively upgrading the German military to give Germany the ability to wage war and win. So while the Luftwaffe would be producing all manner of military aircraft, your fighters, heavy fighters, dive bombers, light and medium bombers, etc., Walther Wever was one of the relative few in the Luftwaffe leadership that saw the potential of larger and longer-range strategic bombers. Germany had very ambitious military goals laid out before them, plans to re-establish Germany as a major power that also happened to require the conquering or subservience of several global powers, which meant that weaponry that could destroy enemy forces behind the front lines would be incredibly valuable. Even with that value, though, there were reasons why Wever was in the relative minority in his views. Germany was in the very early stages of rearming. The Great Depression was still having a significant effect on Germany as a whole, and their production capabilities overall, while being ramped up, were on the lower end of that ramp. Larger heavy bombers would require a lot of resources and factory space and time, all of which could be spent on making greater numbers of smaller aircraft that they were also lacking in. At the very least, the desire for a heavy bomber didn't seem to be logistically in the cards at the moment, but maybe it would be in the future when production had ramped up and more resources were available. Outside of the whole logistical practicality of making a heavy bomber at that time, other military minds of the Luftwaffe had their own views on which type of aircraft would be the most valuable. A man like Ernst Udet, for example, became fascinated with dive bombers, and many others in the Luftwaffe wanted to focus on lower altitude close air support aircraft that would complement their ground forces. It was because of this very prevalent line of thought in the Luftwaffe that a very unnecessary number of German aircraft were equipped with dive brakes to act as ground attackers and close air support. And as the Blitzkrieg would end up being a calling card for the German military in World War II, The views of people like Ernst Udet kind of won out in the end. But with Wever still having a decent amount of power early on, he would end up heading the Ural Bomber project for a new long-range heavy bomber. The name of the project in the Ural Bomber project was very indicative of Germany's military ambitions, being named after the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union. While Germany ended up having a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, and there were even talks for the Soviets to join the Axis, something that was never actually going to happen, it was basically inevitable that Germany would end up going to war with the Soviets. It was kind of part of their whole thing, and Wever was planning for this inevitability. While a great deal of Soviet industrial production was on their western side towards Europe, a significant amount too was located just past the natural defensive wall that was the Ural Mountains. So Wever wanted something that had enough range and power to take out, or at least disrupt, Soviet industrial production that was centered behind the Urals. And for this task, he enlisted the help of Dornier and Junkers, and by 1935, they would provide the Dornier Do-19 and Junkers Ju-89, two large four-engine heavy bombers. The Do-19 would measure in at 25.45 meters long, 35 meters wide, and 5.76 meters tall, with a crew of 10, an empty weight of 26,158 pounds, a defensive armament of two 7.92mm guns and two 20mm cannons, and a bomb load of 3,500 pounds. In the other corner from Junkers would be the Ju-89, measuring 26.49 meters long, 35.29 meters wide, and 7.61 meters tall, with a crew of just 5, an empty weight of 37,840 pounds, a defensive armament of two 7.92mm guns and two to four 20mm cannons, and a bomb load of 3,500 pounds. In terms of aircraft's dimensional size and their armament, the two designs were on relatively equal footing. The Ju-89 was also 11,000 pounds heavier, though, and the reason why can be seen when looking at the two planes side by side. The Ju-89 had a larger, more bulbous fuselage, and wings that were much larger front to back. Presumably, the increased fuselage size was to increase fuel storage and range. For the engines of the two aircraft, the Ju-89 would have a very clear advantage. The Do-19 would have four Brahmo 322 radials with 715 horsepower apiece, while the Ju-89 would have either four UMO 211s or DB600s, both inline engines with around 1,000 horsepower. This greater total horsepower and slight drag reduction would give the Ju-89 a greater potential top speed. Unfortunately, though, I'm not sure what either company projected the specs of each aircraft would be, but you would probably assume that the top speed was to be above 200 miles an hour and the range above 1,000 miles, considering the era, their designs, and the role they were supposed to fill. While these designs and their projected specs were probably relatively decent for a first crack at a heavy bomber design, Wever and the Luftwaffe were nevertheless disappointed in them. They had great military ambitions, and a pair of bombers that were just probably fine for 1935 standards wouldn't be living up to those ambitions, and they would almost certainly be outdated in just a few years. Nevertheless, though, the Reich Air Ministry approved each design, and 3 prototypes of each would be ordered. Elsewhere in the Luftwaffe, though, and also in a separate part of Walther Wever's brain, they started formulating some plans for a new heavy bomber design that would be far superior than either of the Ural bombers. Plans that would eventually call for a range of 3,100 miles and a top speed of at least 311 miles an hour. However, these plans were not released until mid-1936, so Dornier and Junkers would proceed with their what were effectively lame duck heavy bomber designs. The first of the two designs to take to the air would be the Do-19, flying for the first time on October 28, 1936, and due to its pretty underpowered engines, flying without armament and with weight added to simulate a full armament, at sea level, it hit a top speed of just 196 miles an hour, and had a range of just 994 miles. Compare this to something like the Boeing B-17, which had flown for the first time a year prior, and it would have a top speed of 236 miles an hour. Germany's technically more modern design was just plain worse, and this would leave a very low bar for Junkers to clear. In December 1936, the Ju-89 V-1 would take to the air, and the V-2 would follow suit early the next year. And while the two prototypes weren't exactly world beaters, they were at least better than the Do-19. Outfitted with the UMO-211 in the former and the DB-600 in the latter, the Ju-89 managed a top speed of 217 miles an hour at sea level and 242 at altitude, with a maximum range of 1,240 miles. In response to this, Dornier began plans to keep pace with the Junkers design by installing stronger Brahmo 323 engines with around 900 horsepower, projecting a top speed of 230 miles an hour and a range that would match the Ju-89. Unfortunately, though, they never got the opportunity to do so, and Junkers never actually got the opportunity to improve upon the Ju-89, as the entire Ural Bomber project would be pretty abruptly cancelled on April 29, 1937, ending the Luftwaffe's first brief foray into the world of heavy bombers. Basically, both the Ju-89 and Do-19 had a couple months to fly before their entire project was dead. So, what happened exactly? Why were neither of these bombers given the chance to develop and grow past their admittedly lackluster performance? There were several reasons. A very important day for the Ural Bomber project was on June 3, 1936, where two major events happened that signaled the beginning of the end for the project. For one, the specifications for the successor project, the Bomber A project, would be released, and the specs of that project were far more ambitious and better performing. Once a singular design came out of the Bomber A project, the Ural bombers would kinda be dead in the water. But also on the very same day, much more damaging to the Ural Bomber project and the very idea of German heavy bombers as a whole was the fact that Walther Wever died in a plane crash. Flying a Heinkel He, Wever took off from Dresden to fly over to Berlin, very ironically for a funeral he had to attend to. Wever had mistakenly not removed locks from the ailerons, and right as the plane lifted off the ground, it was then thrown into a spin, hit the ground, and exploded. So, with Wever now gone, the main supporter of heavy, long-range strategic bombers in the Luftwaffe was now gone, and his replacement, Albert Kesselring, who may have also supported Wever's opinions on strategic bombers, according to James Coram, Kesselring just didn't seem to have the political pull or wherewithal to push heavy bombers as a concept, Under significant pressure from the likes of Erhard Milch and Ernst Udet and Hermann Göring, the Ural Bomber project was cancelled. In fact, Göring was quoted as saying, in response to some in the Luftwaffe trying to get the Ural Bomber project reinstated, that Hitler wasn't interested in how big the bombers were, but rather how many there were. Wever and, to some extent, Kesselring did eventually get their heavy bomber through the Bomber A project in the HE-177, Germany's only fielded heavy bomber in World War II that was also incredibly problematic. But still, the HE-177 was only introduced in 1942, about halfway into the war, and the very interesting question remains of how World War II would have went if Germany had a heavy bomber at the start of the war. In late 1942, the president of the State Association of the German Aviation Industry, a man named Admiral Rudolf Laas, told Erhard Milch that if the Do-19 and Ju-89 had been allowed to develop, then by 1942 they would have been better than any American or British long-range heavy bomber. Now, while this may have been a bit of a stretch, a bit of overconfidence from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Nazi over here, the presence of a long-range bomber theoretically may have helped during Operation Barbarossa and the Battle of Britain. I say theoretically because they would still need escort fighters that they didn't really have to defend them on these longer-range missions. At the very least, they probably would have been relatively effective flying over Russia, since the Soviets didn't have that much in the way of high-altitude fighters that could take them out. But even still, there's also the problem of limited resources, like fuel and oil, which was a cloud that hung over the Luftwaffe even when Germany was winning. Most of Germany's oil had to be produced synthetically, a rather expensive process. Germany did manage to build up a decent stock of oil early in the war, but after their invasion of the Soviet Union, it became very clear that Germany's oil production could not survive prolonged engagements, and in the first few months of the Eastern Front, their reserves of oil had been cut in half. What this means for heavy bombers and aircraft that would consume a lot more fuel than smaller aircraft was that their production and use probably would have been very limited to save fuel for those frontline close air support aircraft, even if the Ju-89 and Do-19 had been allowed to mature and develop. Germany's limitations on fuel more than likely would have restricted their use and thus overall effectiveness. Regardless, though, the Ju-89 and Do-19 projects were massive flops, with relatively little to talk about in regards to the actual process of making and flying them. But that's also kind of the point. The Ju-89 and Do-19 showed just how little Germany was invested in heavy and long-range bombers, how little the bulk of the Luftwaffe and Reich Air Ministry thought of such aircraft. They very clearly show where Germany's priorities lie, and it seems like their priority wasn't in making all of the cool, big, strong planes that everybody likes. Germany didn't have any interest in being a crowd pleaser. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. So, what did everybody do for New Year's? I played some Mega Man Battle Network 5, the best Battle Network game, and if you say otherwise, you're wrong. Battle Network 3? No. It's good, but not Battle Network 5 good, because Double Souls are way better than the style changes. But anyway, because I could go on for a very long time here, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.